Good morning, Hassan Huskies. This is your principal, Dr. Miller. Today is Monday, March 10th, 2025. Please stand with me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, Hassan Huskies, it's going to be a great week. We have lots of fun things planned this week, and we have birthdays. Happy birthday. All right, we have Grace and Mrs. Stimmick, Ada and Mrs. Greenwald, Lola and Mrs. Greenwald, Madeline and Mrs. Greenwald, Audrey and Mrs. Dazowski, Ava and Mrs. Dockendorf, Henley and Mrs. Reed, Simon and Mr. Spitzak, Guinevere and Mr. Jarvie, Sawyer and Mrs. Roddy, Landon and Mrs. Dockendorf, Arabelle and Mrs. Roddy, Logan and Mr. Jarvie, Anya and Mrs. Leach, Ruby and Mrs. Lazars, Nash and Mrs. Choi. We also have spring break coming up next week. And I hope all of you have fun plans with family and friends for spring break. But I am going to read the birthdays of students who will have their birthday over spring break this year. All right. That is Gavin and Miss Hanlon, Anna and Mrs. Holloway, Grace and Mrs. Holloway, Jennifer and Mrs. Spears, Cameron and Mrs. Edie, Giovanni and Mrs. Klim, Daniel and Mrs. Klim, Blake and Miss Dockendorf, Isaac and Mrs. Dazowski, Dominic and Miss Dockendorf, Marley and Mrs. Craig, Lucy and Mrs. Harns, Athena and Mrs. Stemmick, Marshall and Mrs. Roddy, Natalie and Mrs. Roddy, Landon and Mrs. Holloway, Riley and Mr. Willenbring, Ben and Mrs. Lazars, and Brecken and Mrs. Roddy's class. Happy spring break birthday. All right, Hassan Huskies, it's going to be a great day. And remember, you belong here. And this month, we are talking all about kindness. It's cool to be kind. You know a lot about problems, and you've learned some good ways to solve them. Remember, try to feel calm, breathe slowly, and ask for help. All right, Hassan Huskies, it's a great day to be a Husky.